Okay, so as I was saying, thanks for coming along really to the cusp session today. We're going to focus on the pivotal role of psychologists and psychology in the challenge of tackling arguably the most profound challenges of humankind, so the interconnected crises that are reshaping our planet. Today's session will consist now of three presentations. As Paul mentioned earlier, unfortunately, Sarah Vestergran is ill. She's flued up and literally with no voice. So I'm going to wish her a speedy recovery, and that gives us, I guess, a bit more time for discussion. So that's not too bad. We're going to hear from myself, Sarah Golding, a health psychologist and Access Knowledge Exchange research fellow at the University of Surrey, and Lois Player, who is a PhD student in psychology at Bath. And I'll let each of them do their own sort of more in-depth introductions when they come to present. And just as a bit of a disclaimer, really, before I sort of go into my presentations and things, I'm going to be talking about a couple of terms. I'm going to talk about the global south and the global north. Now, I just want to recognize that these are contested terms and phrases, but just for the purposes of this presentation, specifically, I'm really using the terms from the scholarly perspective that the global south really frequently bears the brunt of global challenges and climate change, but actually are the lowest contributors to these problems. So I'll be using these terms to address spaces and peoples who are effectively disproportionately negatively impacted by climate change. I mean, or not in terms of the global north. Um, so breaking down the crises then, when we talk about the different crises, the interconnected crises, we're talking really about climate crisis, which is about the long-term changes in temperature, precipitation, and atmospheric conditions. As a result of rapidly changing conditions, we're witnessing sort of increasingly common extreme weather events, rising sea levels, disruption to ecosystems on a global scale. The ecological crisis really centres around the degradation and loss of ecosystems and habitats. So nature provides us with sort of vital life support systems, clean air, water and food. And human activities are really accelerating this sort of disruption and crisis, leading to major disruptions really in the delicate balance of those ecosystems. The biodiversity crisis kind of involves the rapid decline in the variety and abundance of species on a global scale. So this manifests as a loss of genetic diversity. It weakens the resilience of ecosystems and then ultimately impacts the overall planetary health. The three crises, as you can see, are super interconnected, with each influencing and exacerbating the others. So, for example, climate change can impact ecosystems and biodiversity. Loss of biodiversity can affect the ability of ecosystems to adapt to climate change. And addressing these crises often requires a really integrated and holistic approach that considers those interdependencies. So while the climate crisis focuses, as I've just said, sort of on changes in the Earth's climate, the ecological crisis encompasses broader ecosystem health, and the biodiversity crisis really specifically addresses those loss of species diversity. And together they highlight the complex challenges facing the planet and the need for comprehensive solutions to really ensure sustainable and resilient futures. So now that we understand the complexities of these crises, sort of, and their interdependencies, the presentations that you're going to hear today are going to outline some of the ways in which psychology can address these. So given that the crises are underpinned by human behavior and that their impacts ultimately threaten human existence, psychology plays a fundamental role in mitigating and adapting to such changes. So, for example, um, sorry, I froze my screen there. So, for example, psychology can contribute to policy design, information campaigns, the ways of engaging with both the public to inform them about climate change and the role that they can play. Organizational psychologists can get business leaders to think about organizational change to address climate change. In terms of politics, working with policymaking organizations and politicians can really contribute to the design of more effective policies and the political processes like citizens' assemblies, etc. And when thinking about communication and media, psychology can help to accurately reflect the way that weather reports, early warning systems, and crisis points such as heat waves and floodings are communicated. Um, Psychology also has a role to play in the design of interventions and policies that are based on understanding human behavior and how to change it, such as personal behaviors, shopping, energy use, travel choices, but also professional behaviors, so resource use in the workplace, integrating sustainability into organizational policies. As academics, we can look at, integrating sustainability within our teaching design and curriculum design. And similarly, psychology can shed light on what sort of policies will be acceptable, how to provide a stronger voice for people in policy making. Psychology also has a role in understanding the different ways, and this is sort of where my research comes in which climate change impacts our health and well-being, and how we can foster resilience and adaptation towards those interventions. So hopefully you'll have received the provocations that Sandra and Paul sent around ahead of the session. They're highlighted here or the first one's highlighted here, and I'll come to the next two in a second on screen just for ease. But these are really starting points for you to think about during the presentations to help facilitate a really meaningful discussion afterwards, and after each, not after each presenter's talk, but after the presenters have talked around understanding psychology's role in addressing these crises and the possible ways in which we as psychologists, scientists and academics can really positively impact and contribute to tackling anthropogenic climate, ecological and biodiversity challenges. And they were the other two thoughts and provocations. So to kick off then, I'm going to talk to you today firstly about health and wellbeing impacts and mental health impacts of climate-related change. I'll be discussing some of my own research around adaptation interventions, as well as my current research focus and grant applications about contextualising and conceptualising wellbeing in the context of climate change. The effects of climate change extend beyond the environmental realm, as I'm sure we all know, significantly influencing a range of mental health challenges and encompassing a variety of responses, such as we see on here, eco-anxiety. So this refers to the state of distress or unease related to the current and future ecological challenges facing the planet. So it's a psychological response to the perceived threat to the environment, such as climate change, deforestation, species extinction, and pollution. And people experiencing eco anxiety may feel sort of overwhelmed, powerless, or fearful about the consequences of environmental degradation. This anxiety can really manifest as a sense of personal responsibility for the planet's health and well-being. Eco grief then involves a profound sense of loss, sadness, and mourning for the ecological damage and the loss of biodiversity and natural ecosystems. It arises from the recognition of the irreversible harm inflicted upon the environment and the realization of the potential future losses. So, individuals experiencing eco grief may mourn the destruction of natural habitats, the extinction of species, and the degradation of natural landscapes. Environmental melancholia and solastalgia are super interconnected, and nuanced, very similar, but sort of nuanced. Environmental melancholia describes a sense of profound sadness, sorrow, or melancholy resulting from the loss of degradation of environments. It's a feeling of, I guess, homesickness or longing for a place that has undergone significant environmental changes. It arises when individuals witness the transformational destruction of cherished natural surroundings, such as landscapes altered by development, pollution, or climate change. And it's characterized similarly to solastalgia by a deep nostalgia for an environment that no longer exists in its previous state. Solastalgia, on the other hand, refers to the distress or emotional suffering experienced when individuals witness the degradation or destruction of their local environment, places that they feel an attachment and identity to. So, unlike environmental melancholia, solastalgia focuses on the negative psychological impact caused by ongoing environmental changes in a person's immediate surroundings. So, it can arise from factors such as land degradation, climate change effects, industrial activities that really do harm the local environment, habitats, and ecosystems. Solastalgia often includes a sense of powerlessness or disconnection from one's environment and can really impact mental well-being. So these terms then, as well as many others, such as PTSD, which can in context be characterized by persistent psychological distress following an encounter with a traumatic event such as hurricanes, wildfires, floods, not to mention the physical health implications and mortality risks of such events, and the fallout or the so-called secondary sort of stresses such as loss of livelihood, inability to get household insurance following floods, etc. They all kind of highlight both the range of the multifaceted impacts and the interconnectedness of these really complex and emotional psychological responses that people can experience in relation to environmental degradation. In addition to psychology's role in understanding the ways in which climate change can impact our health and well-being, and given that globally we need to find ways to mitigate and adapt to climate-related change, psychology is also crucial in terms of successful mitigation and strategies of adaptation. In terms of mitigation, psychologists play a crucial role in understanding and changing human behavior related to resource consumption, waste reduction, sustainable practices, for example. And for adaptation, psychologists can really contribute to building adaptive capacity, addressing mental health challenges, fostering community cohesion, as well as exploring the impacts of adaptation strategies themselves. So, does a seawall built following horrific flooding, where many community members lost their lives, now actually serve as a PTSD trigger for somebody? Or for some people. These examples, by the way, that I'm going to give here, they are actually um, published examples of factors that happen. So an adaptation strategy of a seawall that's built to protect, it's built and inherently understood as well. It it promotes well-being and health because it stops the water coming in. Actually, it can serve to be a trigger. Does migration as an adaptive response negatively impact people's access to resources? Contribute to the spread of sexually transmitted diseases, completely ignore cultural identities and attachments to place, create the foundations for more solastalgia, grief, and anxieties? Does the creation of a dam in an area where one didn't exist before create a breeding ground for varieties of mosquito that actually didn't previously live in the area? Um, Air conditioning units are perhaps the most widely known maladaptation form, so designed to cool from extreme heat, but then, exacerbate our overall carbon footprint. Part of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals is to adapt to and mitigate against climate change and foster healthy and thriving communities for the future. As such, psychology is also vital in developing an understanding of what it means to live well within these diverse contexts and on a global scale. So, going into a little more depth about adaptation strategies specifically, I'm going to talk briefly about a couple of papers from the Healthy Adaptations Project that I worked on when I was at Exeter University and finished sort of here while I was part of the Open University. If anybody's interested, the website link is sort of listed here, and on that website there's sort of various different resources around adaptations and impacts. Okay, so to develop our understanding then of the lived experience of and intersecting vulnerabilities arising from adaptation processes, we designed a survey to capture people's experiences of adaptation and its impacts on their lives. The broader project looks at the lived experiences of a variety of social measures and perceived impacts across different adaptation strategies internationally. And I'll come to some interesting overall findings shortly. But for the next couple of slides, I'm really going to focus specifically on the psychosocial implications of relocation as an adaptive strategy to flooding in two communities in coastal Ghana, so Keta and Totope. You can see on the screen now some pictures of Keta and Totope. And I know that the disappearing villages of the Ghanaian coastline along the Volta Delta region are extremely well known. But actually, when we were stood by the building in the top right circle there in Keta, and the community elders were with us and telling us that actually once they were 3 kilometers away from the sea. It really is sobering to see just how much these villages and coastlines are disappearing and just how quickly. I have a short video that we developed, and these are all on the website, but as part of an online healthy adaptation, the online healthy adaptations hub, that will sort of allude to all the findings. But in brief, our findings really suggested that, at least for these communities, relocation has consequences for social processes of identity and attachment, as well as perceptions of safety, anxiety, and well-being. I'll just sort of play the video. It's literally 2 minutes long.
Help understand some of the ways that climate adaptations and relocation can impact people, a multinational team of researchers from the University of Ghana, Maynooth University, and the University of Exeter recently surveyed residents from both relocated and non-relocated coastal communities in Ghana. People living in the relocated area of Keta reported that they felt more anxiety and felt much less safe than members of another community further along the same coastline called Totope who have not been relocated. Residents from the village of Totope have not yet managed to relocate because the government could not provide them with a suitable location nor adequate funding to do so. Many of these community members are fishers, and it would take them a long time to get to the sea from the location that the government wants them to move to. There were also no funds available to build a community centre, a school, or a place of worship in the new location. These cases highlight the key elements that planners need to heed when it comes to climate adaptation. That is, understanding the potential for the well-being of people and communities to be affected through economic, social, environmental, and health impacts that can arise from the adaptation process. For example, in the case of Totope, ensuring continued access to livelihoods and community facilities will be crucial to the long-term resilience of the people living there. And you can only fully understand how communities are likely to be affected by listening to them and taking their views and experiences into account. This means that it is also key for the process of planning adaptations to include early and equitable engagement with individuals and communities. Doing so will ensure that there is a fully shared understanding around why a specific adaptation intervention must take place, what the needs of specific communities might be, and that the well-being of community members will not suffer as a result of the intervention. While every instance of climate change adaptation will be different depending on where in the world it is carried out, lessons from places like Ghana can be applied wherever decision makers are thinking about carrying out relocation or any other significant types of adaptation in response to climate-related change.
So, putting all of that into context, then, relocation doesn't happen in a vacuum, but it unfolds in complex socio psychological contexts where issues like identity, attachment, security all become pivotal to well-being. The experiences of Quetta and Totope in the Volta Delta region highlight the varied realities of relocation strategies. Specifically for Totope, no viable relocation options have been offered to the community. So, for me, the idea that processes of adaptation that do not consider the community's access to livelihood, their wider social structures, such as community and education spaces, are offered as pragmatic and realistic solutions to climate change are a real concern. Furthermore, even where apparently adequate alternative community spaces have been sourced, as is with Quetta, the failure of incorporating psychological understandings of how these adaptation processes are experienced and manifest in the context of each specific community really serves to undermine the well-being of the community members, and in the context of these surveys and studies, the perceptions of safety and their processes of identity. So, returning to the whole project then, and quickly, we wanted to really understand the pervasive shifts of adaptation strategies on everyday life. So, despite the variety of adaptation strategies under examination and implementation around the world, there remains a significant gap in understanding the lived experience of such processes. While we know conceptually that large scale environmental change impacts health and well-being, there's little understanding of how and in what ways these impacts are manifest across both communities, which I will come to shortly in a second, but also across adaptation types. And importantly, given that adaptation strategies impact communities collectively, the implications adaptation processes have on community dynamics also remains underexplored. So within this research, we really wanted to address this gap by kind of exploring the lived experiences of those adaptation processes and their consequences on group dynamics. Employing social psychological theories as a lens, this research really looks to dissect how those communities as groups maneuver through social environmental alterations. As I'm sure most of you know, but I'll say in brief, social identity theory posits that individuals derive a portion of their self concept from membership to social groups, and that those groups will seek to positively differentiate their own in group from other out groups. Research conducted within this tradition across a variety of contexts has demonstrated that increased levels of social identification acts as a buffer against the negative impacts of large scale change, and that those processes are often mediated through psychological processes such as efficacy, engagement, perceived support, perceptions of safety and self-esteem. and others. Despite the application, however, of the social identity approach across a number of different contexts, the role of identity in shaping the lived experience of climate related adaptation interventions is underexplored. So this research really seemed to bridge that gap in understanding the interplay between community adaptation strategies to climate change, and specifically in the context of flooding and the resultant on group dynamics. What we kind of found, so as I said, that we'd done these sort of surveys where, in addition to Ghana, we looked here at nature-based solutions in the UK, in Somerset, and hard engineering, so sea walls in Ireland. And there were 6 communities, 2 in each of the country contexts. Um, we conducted multi-level modelling to really explore the group processes and understand how they relate to well-being. And in line with social identity theorising, the results of the study supported the core prediction that social identification with a group of actors in the context of flood adaptation interventions is linked to increased well-being. Where identification is high, well-being is increased and anxiety is reduced. And in line with previous social identity research, this relationship between identity and well-being was mediated through psychological processes of engagement, collective efficacy, and perceived safety. And importantly, this relationship held across all country and adaptation contexts. So, regardless of whether you're a community member in Ireland, the UK, or Ghana, or whether you're experiencing nature based solutions, relocation, or engineering strategies as your adaptation strategy, the more you identify with the community, the safer you feel, the more engaged you feel, and the more confident you are that your community can achieve its climate related goals. And this ultimately led to increased well being and reduced anxiety. Some of the biggest struggles then that we had when we were doing sort of the healthy adaptations more broadly, and when we were commissioned to do this paper around climate change and well-being, was that there are so many different conceptualizations of well-being across discipline and sector. So, for example, the health sciences treating well-being as synonymous with mental and physical health, and often privilege physiological and psychological processes over social factors in any sort of explanatory models and measures. Economics and other social scientists, by contrast, kind of principally treat well-being as synonymous with financial security and standards of living, and hence privilege objective outcome measures over subjective outcome measures. Environmental and geographical sciences and applied social psychology value the critical role of environmental conditions and places, such as spaces and identities that are culturally constructed, and how they shape collective well-being. So there are also diverse person centered frameworks that seek to characterize the dimensions of well-being. So many of these share the idea, perhaps most influentially proposed by Maslow, that there are universal human needs whose fulfillment determines the extent to which people feel and function well. So there are many different understandings of what well-being is and how to achieve it, and how climate change impacts people. We know that also happens in many different ways. Some of the impacts are more visible, some are less visible, some are long lasting, some take times to develop. But what we can all agree on is that climate change impacts, adaptations, and policies around climate change are affecting people and communities on a global scale. They are experienced and understood in terms of collective understanding and relational traits, so within and between communities, places, and social contexts. So following on from this research, and part of the impetus, I guess, for today's session and this discussion, is that I'm now trying to develop a deeper understanding of what it means to live well in the broader social, cultural, economic, political context of climate change, that considers the role of power and inequality in developing a rich understanding of the experiences of climate change that are really grounded in inclusivity, equity, and diversity. The Impacts Project overview, as you can see here, is part of a UKRI Future Leaders grant that I'm currently applying for, which aims to really bring together multiple disciplines and sectors across multiple contexts to really understand the convergences and intersections of well-being in the context of climate-related change, and to develop a multidimensional conceptualization of what it means to live well to help achieve sustainability and resilience in the face of our rapidly kind of changing climate. As a bit of a recap, then, climate change is having far reaching impacts on individuals and communities on a global scale. In response, governments worldwide are pledging commitments to tackling climate change, building transformative, sustainable, and resilient communities for the future. However, despite the increasing attention to addressing the climate emergency, narrow interpretations of how climate change is experienced, how impacts manifest across populations, and multiple conceptualizations of what constitutes well-being across these contexts really reduces the chances of meeting global policy development goals and creating those sustainable and transformative changes. Research conducted in diverse contexts has demonstrated that climate-related changes have greater impacts based on population vulnerabilities such as gender, age, indigenous peoples, and minority groups. Furthermore, studies have revealed a compounding effect of climate change on existing disparities and amplifies mental health vulnerabilities. Even processes of adaptations, as I've started to talk to here, that are designed to protect against climate change and disaster often result in trade-offs between mitigation and well-being, with well-being being implied through a reduction of risk and rarely integrated explicitly into the policies and planning processes. And that's me, finally, over just slightly. Oh, I don't know how to bring that back. Great. And have I stopped sharing? Stop sharing. There we go.
Wonderful, thank you, Stacey. Am I next, I believe?
You're next,
right?
sorry, passing
Great.
on
No,
to
no,
Sarah.
that's fine. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Bear with me. Do you all have my slide, opening slide?
We can see ourselves at the minute.
Oh, that's not good. Bear with me. Let's try again. And is that the slide?
There we are.
Got
That's it.
Fantastic. Good. Okay. Thanks ever so much, Stacey, for that great overview, and particularly the introductory part explaining, the interlinked nature of these climate, biological, ecological crises that we are currently facing. So my name's Sarah Golding. I'm based at the University of Surrey. I work on the Access Project as a Knowledge Exchange Fellow, and I'm going to be talking, sort of switching the focus away from the climate to talk a bit more now about sort of nature and the biodiversity side of it. Just as a way of quick introduction to me, I normally include a slightly more professional photo, but this is me graduating just over 10 years ago from the Open University. I did my undergraduate psychology degree with the OU, and I would literally not be here today talking to you without the OU and all that it stands for and the opportunities and so on. That's my sister, who's always my champion cheerleader as well. So yeah, great photo. Anyway, back on topic. So after I graduated, I trained as a health psychologist. Basically, I'm interested in the way that our psychology interacts with predominantly physical health outcomes, but of course, recognizing that the mind and the body are not separate. Physical and mental health outcomes are intrinsically linked with each other, and also with, as Stacey touched on, things like social well-being, community well-being, and also broader environmental well-being. So a lot of my work is focused in these paradigms such as the One Health or planetary health approaches, which tries to more explicitly recognise, move away from a kind of traditional biomedical model of health where we focus just on medicine and just on the human physiology, and we start to think more broadly about how human health and well-being is interlinked with the health and well-being of other animals, of other life on the planet, including microbes and other kind of fungi and things that we don't often think about so much, and of course the broader ecosystem and earth systems that we find ourselves embedded in. We can't have healthy, thriving human societies if we don't also have a healthy, thriving, broader ecosystems. And so today I'm going to be focusing on one aspect of the work that I am involved with, which is around exploring the links between nature and well-being in the broadest possible senses of those terms. And I'm going to be talking about the relationship between people and the natural world in kind of two directions. So I'm going to start by talking about how spending time in nature is good for us, essentially. I'll be talking about the benefits of nature engagement for people. why nature is good for us and why we need to obviously do our best to protect and preserve and restore and conserve natural environments. And then I'll be flipping it and thinking about it in the other direction. What's the impact of humans on the natural world, with a specific focus on biodiversity decline and how psychological frameworks might be able to help us halt and reverse some of that biodiversity decline. So starting from the position then that nature is essentially good for us, there's an huge amount of evidence that shows that spending time in the natural world or being connected to the natural world is, broadly speaking, good for people. So I'm just going to spend a bit of time talking about that. First of all, what am I talking about when we talk about nature and nature engagement? So nature is essentially the living world around us, but also the abiotic, the non-living aspects of the world. I think of it in the broadest possible sense, but of course in the literature, a lot of the early work looking at exploring why nature is good for us focused on so-called green spaces, so things like forests, wilderness landscapes, countryside farmland, urban parks, so that kind of thing. But then, in recent years, there's been an increase in recognition of the need to also look at other types of natural environments. So blue spaces are those that are predominated by water, coastlines, rivers, etc., that kind of space. And also in more recent years, starting to think about other forms of nature, so digital or virtual environments, or engaging with nature online, for example. And again, thinking about the development of the literature, often early work for a long time has been focused on what the environment looks like, the physical features, the visual aspects of what can we see in a space, buildings, trees, etc. But increasingly, psychologists and others are starting to think about the other sensory aspects of the natural world, or being in particular environments, so the soundscapes, the smells, the embodied experience of the kind of physical sensations beyond just what we can see. And nature engagement itself can either be passive or active. So it could be incidental, it could be walking down a street where there's trees, it could be simply being in a sort of green or blue space doing a different type of activity. Or it could involve much more active engagement with the natural world. So things like wildlife watching, conservation activities, gardening, and so on. So, in the broadest possible sense, nature engagement refers to being engaged in the natural world in some way, interacting in the natural world in some way. And I've set a deliberately broad context around this, just because the literature that I'm going to discuss does take broad definitions. And there are limitations around that, of course. Sometimes it's well defined, sometimes less well defined. That makes it harder for us as nature researchers to really understand what's going on, but there are broad pictures here. So thinking about the benefits for the individual, spending time in nature, living in greener or bluer spaces, having good access to high quality natural environments is associated with a huge number of different physical and mental health benefits. So thinking about longer healthy life years, better physical heart health, for example, lower rates of metabolic disease like diabetes, greater general sense of mental well-being, but also lower rates of mental ill health such as anxiety and depression. And then also we see psychological impacts, so recovering from cognitive fatigue or feeling better or mood lifting and so on after spending time in natural environments or greener environments compared to sort of more urban built environments in general. But then also thinking beyond the individual, thinking about more collective benefits as well. So there are social benefits from spending time in nature, spaces like front gardens, particularly front gardens that are utilised and cared for, allotments, urban parks. They can all help to kind of increase social and community cohesion. Having access to natural spaces can also help to reduce social isolation amongst different groups of people. And being connected to nature, spending time in nature, being engaged with nature is also linked to broader concern for the natural world and the environment, and is related to being more engaged with pro-environmental behaviours. So, kind of hopefully reiterating the starting point, spending time in nature is good for us and our communities and our planet in a high level sense. However, access to nature varies. Not everybody in the UK or around the world has equal access to good quality green or blue spaces, whether that's for recreation or just for somewhere to spend time, a break from work, any of these kind of things. When you look at the literature, there are lots of socio-demographic variability in who has access to nature, who can benefit from nature, and so on. So these things absolutely need to be considered and are increasingly considered and recognised in the literature. There are both real and perceived issues, for example, to spending time in a natural place or accessing a natural place. That could be kind of perceptions of, ickiness, disgusting. Some people just don't like the idea of being in a natural space, getting their hands dirty, fear of animals, fear of wildlife, for example. And some of that can be a misperception, but some of it can be a real threat, and there's also other kind of like personal safety issues related to, for example, gendered experiences, racialized experiences, perceptions that a space might be related to sort of unsafety, antisocial behaviour for some reason. And so we do need to recognise that. And, as researchers, when we're making recommendations, say for policymakers about how to increase access to nature, we need to be thinking about who can access it already, who already has the economics means, the financial means, private transport to get there, time, because you only have to work one job as opposed to maybe two, and you don't, so there's lots of kind of demographic factors that need to be taken into account when we talk about the benefits of nature engagement. Not everyone has access to those benefits because not everyone has access to good quality green and blue space. So putting that aside, very briefly going to touch on some different perspectives about what the psychological literature and other kind of related disciplines might say about why nature is good for us. There's a range of different perspectives. They all kind of offer different things. There's limitations and strengths to all of them. This is just a sort of snapshot of some of the bigger key perspectives that are in the nature engagement literature. So there's kind of cognitive perspectives, thinking about, basically our everyday lives are tiring, we get worn out, we go into nature, and there's aspects of the natural environment that help us feel better, essentially, help us recover cognitively. The same around the idea that we become physiologically stressed, emotionally aroused in everyday life. Spending time in natural environments can help the body to reset, if you like. There's also individual different perspectives where, there's various different ways of measuring nature connectedness, different measures that capture different dimensions, basically of how much a person's sense of self overlaps with their sense of the earth, if you like, or the sense of nature. Do they feel closely connected to nature or very disconnected? And there's also evolutionary perspectives. The biophilia hypothesis, for example, is the idea that humans have an innate need to seek out natural environments or connect with other life forms, for example. And as I've mentioned, they've all got their pros and their cons, they all have limitations, but they're all useful ways of looking at different aspects of the people-nature environment, if you like. And then just to very quickly touch on a project that I was involved in during the early years of the COVID pandemic. This is just one snapshot of some qualitative work that we're writing up at the moment. I spoke to 34 people during the first year of COVID to basically interview them using their own photographs to help guide the story about how they felt the natural world did or didn't support their well-being during the COVID, the first year of sort of lockdowns and ongoing restrictions in the UK. And I just wanted to highlight this one because the theme in particular is, I'm particularly enthusiastic about this aspect of the paper, but all of the data. What's really magical about the data set is, to me, it's really clear that there's a relational and intersubjectivity that's happening between people and their environments, different aspects of their environments. And it's that intersubjectivity, that relational nature, that is magical for people, that helps contribute to the sense of well-being and joy and pleasure that they get from spending in natural environments. And one particular theme is exploring the more than human intersubjectivities, the more than human relationships. So people talked with huge amounts of joy and enthusiasm about interacting with wildlife or plants, but also the non-living aspects of the world. So this particular person had a real fascination with sunlight. She sent me so many pictures of the light through different trees. And apologies, that's my cat walking across the keyboard, changing the slide. Animals are brilliant. That's what I like to say. So yeah, so she's thrown me off track. Anyway, so the point is that there's something about the interaction between people and their environments. It's not a static experience being in nature. It is a dynamic, contextual, ever-changing, interesting experience. So then moving beyond the kind of the human focus, the psychological focus about why natural environments are good for us, there's also, of course, something about the environmental quality itself. What's the presence or absence of, for example, pollutions, toxins, allergens, etc. What's the infrastructure whether that's natural or built infrastructure in an environment, that can contribute to physical and mental well-being or ill health. And one of the areas of the literature that I'm particularly interested in, I've got colleagues who work with this at the environmental psychology group with me in the University of Surrey, is exploring the role of biodiversity and how that supports human health and well-being, and also how that can help psychological outcomes. So, for example, there's work that shows that people perceive greater restoration if they spend time in a garden with greater biodiversity, greater range of plants and flowers, notice more birds, etc., that kind of thing. So that's where I'm going to move shortly to focus on talking about biodiversity. But before I do that, I really just wanted to flag, much as Stacey did, you know, some of these terms, they're contested terms, or they have limitations to them. So much of the work I've talked about comes from the weird context. We have to acknowledge that this is an issue in a lot of psychological research. This work is done in a UK, or not just simply a UK context, but, you know, a westernized context. So we have our own cultural narratives about the natural world, about the human relationship to the natural world, and, you know, arguably even separating humans from the natural world, as some dominant narratives do within the westernized world, is a false dichotomy and is just not recognisable across the globe. So just to flag that there are, of course, limitations. That's not to say that coming from a westernised perspective, that's not to invalidate that perspective, but that we need to, as psychological researchers, acknowledge that that is our situation, that's our cultural context, and that it's not applicable to everybody. So then, just flipping the relationship round for the last couple of minutes, I just wanted to talk about how psychology can help to basically hopefully halt the biodiversity decline that's happening around us. So, as I'm sure you're aware, as Stacey touched on right at the beginning of the talk as well, biodiversity decline globally is dramatic and unprecedented. We're seeing huge loss of different types of species across all kinds of different types of species, animal, plant, insects, etc. And a huge amount of this biodiversity decline is a result of human activity related to climate change, habitat loss, land use changes, etc. And you look at any of these kind of reports globally, and you will see all kinds of depressing statistics. They're heartbreaking. Much like all of this is heartbreaking. Some of the terms Stacey talked about around eco-grief. Yeah, eco-grief is a good one. I can relate to that. Anyway, so it's humans fundamentally that need to change our behaviour. We know this. Well, psychologists know this. And increasingly, obviously, of course, people involved in climate and biodiversity work are recognising that we need to think differently about how humans are acting on the world, and there are increasing calls for, you know, at the international level, to work harder, to implement more policies to try and halt biodiversity loss and support essentially nature recovery, which is kind of one of the policy phrases in the UK at the moment. And I, as a psychologist, want to, of course, make the case that we need to use psychological behavioural theory to help support the behaviour change that are going to be needed by individuals, organisations and governments to drive changes around biodiversity. And so I come from a health psychology background, and this is a model that's very widely used in health psychology and is increasingly being used now across other branches of psychology, called the behaviour change wheel. It's based on the COMBI model of behaviour, which some of you may be familiar with already. So COMBI is the idea that in order for a behaviour to happen, we need to have the capability, the opportunity and the motivation for that behaviour to happen. And there are many factors out there that can either help or hinder the likelihood of those behaviours happening. So the behaviour change wheel was developed by health psychologists to help us understand, first of all, what are the facilitators and barriers to a particular behaviour? What makes it more likely that it will happen or less likely? And then how can we translate that knowledge of what's preventing or encouraging a behaviour into a meaningful behaviour change intervention? So the COMBI model is a synthesis of lots of different psychological theories. It brings together insights from across psychology and behavioural science. And then it uses a theoretical underpinning to suggest which types of intervention will be most theoretically appropriate, depending on what we need to change, what we need to target. And so just to kind of close out then, this is just an example that Melissa Marcel, who's one of my colleagues at Surrey, has done a lot of work around applying the behaviour change wheel to biodiversity conservation policies. So for example, she has used the behaviour change wheel as a framework to interrogate the National Action Plan, Global Action Plan biodiversity conservation policies at a national level. To basically look at, who is supposed to do the behaviour, what is the behaviour, are these policies clearly enough well defined in order to drive meaningful action. And one of the ways that the behaviour change wheel and the COMBI can be used is to help us ask some questions. What's the specific behaviour that needs to change? So if we think about recovery for pollinators, for example, you could start with a grand aim of, we want to restore pollinator landscapes. Well, then a psychologist using the behaviour change wheel would ask, well, what are the specific behaviours that are needed to restore a pollinator landscape? Do we need to plant more wildflowers? Do we need to plant native hedgerows, for example? So you specify the actual behaviour that needs to happen. You then need to specify who it is that needs to change that behaviour. Is it gardeners? Is it farmers? Is it local authorities? Is it campsite owners? Who needs to plant the native hedgerows or the wildflowers? And then what are the barriers and the facilitators? Is it economics? Is it incentives? Is it time? There's a whole range of different things. And the barriers and facilitators might be different for different groups of people. And so once we've understood what it is that's driving or preventing a particular behaviour, we then use the behaviour change wheel to come up with theory-driven behaviour change interventions that target those specific barriers and facilitators. And the other way that the behaviour change wheel can be used, and has been used by Melissa and her colleagues, is to basically say, are we using the full range of possible ways of intervening? And the short answer is no. There's lots of kind of areas where future interventions could be designed using a psychological lens to help hopefully drive more effective behaviour change interventions. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. This is the Access Network that I'm a part of. Very happy to chat more about that in the Q&A or offline. And these other people on the other side are the People in Nature in a Pandemic colleagues, which is the more than human stuff I was talking about earlier. Thank you for listening. And there's all of these refs if anyone wants them later. Have I stopped? Yes. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. That was super interesting. Yeah, brilliant. And Lois, I'll hand over to you. I'll hand over to you. That's a Freudian slip if ever I heard one.
Oh, that was great, Sarah. Thank you so much. Just going to share my screen. Can everyone hear me okay and see that okay? Great. Amazing. So yeah, hi everyone, I'm Lois, and thanks so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here and chat to you. And today I'm going to be discussing why psychology is important in fighting the climate crisis through the lens of policy acceptability. So specifically, I'm going to be discussing how psychological insights can help us understand how to foster support for climate policies. And maybe just to start a little bit about myself. So yeah, I'm Lois and I'm a PhD student in psychology at the beautiful University of Bath. And my PhD focuses on understanding the public acceptability of climate policies, predominantly in the transport sector. So I specifically look at a policy called clean air zones, which are restricted inner city areas which charge the most polluting vehicles from entering a specific area, and they aim to reduce air pollution in cities. And so I was really excited to come and speak to you today about how psychology can help us understand and ultimately promote climate policy acceptance, because it's very well aligned with my PhD. So excellent. To quickly outline what I'm going to discuss today, I'll start by discussing some of the background of why climate policy acceptance is really important. Then some information on why and how psychological theories and psychological literature, what they can tell us about the public acceptability of climate policies, and also think about how psychological insights can help us understand how to remove barriers to acceptability. And finally, think about some mechanisms to shape or facilitate policy acceptability. So really promote the acceptance of climate policies before concluding. So let's begin with a definition of climate policies and some examples. And climate policies are policies designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution and to prepare populations for the impacts of climate change, like Stacey's talked about earlier. And they're being developed all the time. So here I've highlighted a few prominent ones, including the ultra low emission zones, ULEZ in London, which some of you might remember recently caused a lot of controversy where they tried to expand it. And this basically was like a clean air zone to control polluting vehicles from entering the inner city areas of London. Another example might be introducing subsidies for electric vehicles to increase uptake, and also things like incentives for reducing the consumption of meat and dairy, and adopting more sort of plant-based alternatives, and things like government grants for home energy, so heat pumps, as you can see here in homes. There's lots more examples, but those are some prominent ones. And I guess a key question in your mind now is, why is it important to have the public buy-in and support for climate policies? And if policies are not well accepted by the public, they're much more likely to be withdrawn, terminated, or redesigned. And as you can see by these news headlines, climate policies do tend to be quite contentious, and public disdain for clean air zones, as you can see by that top headline, has led to lots of them being redesigned. Just here where I am in Bath, the clean air zone was made less strict following public opposition. And then things like meat taxes have faced a lot of public disdain, and because of that, governments aren't even considering them here in the UK. They've also got things like low traffic neighbourhoods, which reached a lot of public outrage. They are sort of like residential areas which restrict cars from driving through with bollards and planters and things like that. And they've been overturned in lots of cities, like in London. And so you can see here, public opinion really does have a big impact on how well policies are perceived, but also how effective they can be, because often they're withdrawn without this acceptance. And beyond better implementation, exploring public support also helps us understand the challenges that policies might create for certain groups. It helps the policymakers address them and also design fairer policies that work for all social groups. And exploring policy acceptance also tells us the parts of policies that people might be concerned about. And therefore, because of all of this, it informs how to best communicate a policy to the public to try and facilitate that acceptance. So overall here, we can really see that having public support for climate policies makes it more effective in achieving its goals, because it's better perceived and therefore probably better adhered to. But many climate policies are not initially well accepted. And really, to understand why that is the case and move them to a place where they are well accepted, psychological research, insights and theories are really needed to understand that. So I wanted to show you first how psychological theories can help us understand support for climate policies. And this is quite a crazy looking model, but many theories have been proposed to explain people's policy support. And this one has been proposed in the literature, but if we break it down, it basically incorporates lots of existing models, for example, the technology acceptance model and the theory of planned behaviour, and some more general policy specific beliefs. And for context, the technology acceptance model states that things like a policy's perceived benefits, its costs and its risks are conducive to acceptability. And the theory of planned behaviour focuses on things like social norms, so perceptions of what others are doing, and one's perceived control over a policy, so perceived behavioural control, impacts policy acceptance. So really, if we break it down to its basics, existing literature is really just telling us that policy support is related to a mixture of psychological factors, like you can see in blue there, things like social norms, attitudes, perception of the problem, and policy-specific beliefs. So things about perceptions of that specific policy's fairness or their risks or the benefit to oneself. And you can see that highlighted there in orange. And so, founded on these psychological theories, existing literature has really found that 4 main types of variables influence people's policy support. And the first of these is socio-demographic factors. And here we find that things like being younger, being female, having no children, and having a higher household income are related to the public acceptance of climate policies in general. But they do poorly explain differences in support overall. So the evidence base is really quite mixed on these, and we don't think they're very conducive to explaining support overall. And secondly, there's these travel-related factors, so things like not owning a car and driving infrequently. This is in the case of transport policies, but they do tend to explain some differences in support, but not many. Then psychological factors, so things like environmental identity, having a left-leaning political ideology, and strong sense of moral obligation or moral norms towards the environment. And they tend to explain policy support relatively well. And whilst here we are focusing on travel-related policies, these are pretty consistent over all climate policies. And finally, policy-specific factors seem to explain the most variance in policy acceptability. So that's things like perceived personal outcome and effectiveness of the policy, fairness of the policy, and what we call distributive fairness, which is essentially fairness to other social groups. So often people on lower incomes or people who perhaps are elderly, usually more vulnerable populations. And these factors tend to explain support very well. So this previous research has told us which kinds of groups of people might oppose climate policies, but actually psychological research can give us more specific guidance to policymakers by showing us the types of barriers that people might face that might make them oppose a policy. So policymakers can then address those specific challenges that they found out through research in their policymaking. And I'm going to briefly discuss here an example of this in my own work. So I conducted a study looking at the public acceptability of a clean air zone. This was here in Bath. And this research had around 1,280 Bath residents. And they completed a survey before the clean air zone was brought in. And we basically ranked how important various factors were to clean air zone acceptability using something called a dominance analysis. And essentially, for the whistle-stop tour of some of the results, we found that while some psychological factors like having a high sense of moral obligation towards the environment and a high environmental identity were important to acceptance, we interestingly saw that key practical barriers were really important in determining acceptability. So, for example, those living closer to the clean air zone and those without dependent children were more accepting. And this is even whilst accounting for psychological factors. So whilst controlling for those differences in psychological factors, those practical factors were still really important to the public acceptance of climate policies. And these findings show us which practical barriers might be most important for policymakers to focus on and provide more tangible guidance to them. So, for example, as I've suggested on the screen, parents might need more support to use public transport or active travel than those who aren't parents. And those living further away from the clean air zone, being less supportive, might indicate that having adequate public transport and infrastructure into the town centre is really, really important. And that isn't spoken about so much in the literature. Often it's spoken about financial incentives and that sort of thing, but really infrastructure came out as an important thing here. And then finally, the finding that having a higher environmental identity boosts acceptance infers that maybe positioning climate policies as a sort of green initiative might boost acceptance in these populations. And so moving on from how we can understand acceptability and remove barriers for certain groups, Psychological research can also tell us a lot about how we can facilitate acceptance of climate policies. So really shape the support for climate policies. And one way of doing this is framing. And so, there we go. One way of doing this is framing, which is a way of presenting information in a way that sort of guides interpretation. And so research generally tells us that positively framed messages, which focus on the sort of health and environmental issues, are more likely to bolster climate support than other types of frames. But I really want to focus on framing around co-benefits of policies, and these can be really, really effective in boosting support. So co-benefits essentially just means any other benefit aside from an environmental one that a climate policy may have. And so in the UK, framings around benefits to the NHS are particularly effective. And frames around job creation and affordable housing tend to be quite universally supported as well. And generally communicating multiple co-benefits is better. However, it's really important to note here that people's preferences for co-benefits do depend on their individual priorities. So for example, someone might have more of a preference for the NHS, others may be more concerned about energy security, and therefore tailoring the co-benefit framing to the specific population that you're addressing is really the most effective thing that you can do. It's important to know, as with all sort of psychological techniques, that it doesn't universally boost support. Framing has been criticised since it often boosts support in populations who are already quite supportive. So from already quite high levels, you get an increase of probably about 2 to 3%. So I want to move on to a method that is a little bit more effective in shaping policy acceptability. So another way is by rolling out climate policies alongside other social and economic reforms. And this is called policy bundling. And early research has found evidence that including a policy, so social policy, so for example, affordable housing could be an example, in a policy bundle increased overall support by around 11%. And then increasing an economic policy, so like a job guarantee, for example, increased support by 12%. And interestingly, this study found that including a social policy alongside an environmental policy boosted support the most amongst lower income groups. And this is a really important finding because these are the groups who typically will be less supportive to begin with and may require more support and face more barriers in acceptance. So that's a really interesting finding. And a final method that I really wanted to talk about and give a really interesting case study for is around involving the public in climate policy making. And I was really interested earlier to hear Stacey talk about the importance of community engagement in the adaptation responses, because some of the findings here in more mitigation policies are really similar. And so research is suggesting that engaging with the public at early stages of policy making is really important. This is when the design is not set in stone, you're more presenting a problem to the public and allowing them to really feel as though they have a say in the policy making process, feel as though it's fair, effective and beneficial to all social groups. And these policies, these sort of processes typically create a stronger sense of ownership, trust, and also the legitimacy of the process. It makes it more transparent. People feel as though they know what's going on behind the curtain, and people feel more actively involved. And because of all of this, people's perceptions of fairness are increased. And that's really strongly, those perceptions of fairness are really strongly linked to policy support. Almost universally in lots of studies. So in turn, policymakers can really understand the lived experiences of the populations, as Stacey was talking about the importance of that as well, and create the fairer policies that are inevitably better accepted. So inevitably, you're creating policies which are fairer, better designed, and therefore more accepted. So really a win all round. And myself and some of my colleagues at Bath actually wrote a report that included some information on this for the UK Climate Change Committee, so the government's climate advisors, and I've added a QR code in the corner to those slides if anyone's interested in reading more on that. And I wanted to share a good example of public participation in climate policy making. So an instance of where this is done really well is the UK Climate Assembly. And this was the UK's first national citizens' assembly. So a citizens' assembly is essentially just a representative group of citizens who are selected at random from the population to learn about and deliberate on and ultimately make recommendations about an issue or a set of policies. And the Climate Assembly sought to understand how the UK should reach its climate goals by 2050 and invited 110 people from the UK population to examine UK climate policies. And that was over 6 weekends in 2020. So quite the undertaking. And as a result, several changes that I've shown here on screen were made to policies. So an earlier shift to electric vehicles, EVs, improvements to public transport, a need to reduce aviation growth and the expansion of airports, and also, quite surprisingly from what I've heard, a greater reduction in meat and dairy was seen to be a useful thing. And beyond that, so we've seen that they've made changes to the policies, but in my mind, one of the most important outcomes from this is that people's individual knowledge was furthered and it stimulated this big public and media debate. But it also increased the confidence in the UK government to make policy decisions. And after the sessions, it was sort of unanimous that the climate goals were felt to be more achievable. And that's a really big, that says a lot in terms of the importance of including the public in policy making, because ultimately people then feel as though they're engaged, they've had a meaningful impact in policymaking, and they've been able to influence policy decisions before they were set in stone. So they feel this sort of ownership and control over policies. So wrapping all of this up, how can psychology help us understand and facilitate the acceptance of climate policies? And research in this field has shown us that psychological and policy-specific factors might explain public support for policies. But beyond this, research has identified that practical barriers that impact support and help policymakers to tailor policies to specific populations are also really, really important. So that could be people like parents or those living in rural areas as examples. Psychological research has also given us a lot of learning about how to shape policy acceptability. So, for example, by using co-benefit framing that we've spoken about, policy bundling, and also involving the public in those policy decisions. And the UK Climate Assembly was a really excellent example of how to involve the public. And ultimately, the outcome of all of this is that psychological research can help in creating policies that are fair for all social groups, well accepted by all, and therefore really effective in achieving their climate goals because they're well adhered to and, yeah, well accepted by all. Now, that's all I had for today, but really happy to chat more. And there's my social media handles, and there's some references as well if anyone's interested in looking at the slides. Thank you.